Perfect. Well, welcome everyone, those who are watching from their living rooms, those who are watching live, those who are watching a recording much later. Welcome to yet another book event of the PACT virtual book event series. As some of you might know, PACT is an AHRC-funded project, Pluralist Agreement and Constitutional Transformation. As part of PACT, we are members of a team based at SOAS, York, Oxford, and National Law School, Bangalore, with CLPR, the Center for Law and Policy Research in Bangalore, as our project partners. This is a team that's building an advanced research tool on the making of the Indian Constitution. And part of what the project is trying to do is to foreground the history of India's constitution making, the history of Indian constitutional political thought, and political thought of the founding era. And we're very glad to have with us today two excellent new authors, Amar, Sohal, and Vanya, Bhargav. I'll introduce our authors first. We'll hear from the authors, and then we'll hear from our two discussants, who I will introduce in due course. Amar Sohal is an early career research fellow in politics and international studies at the University of Cambridge, Corpus Christi College. He is an intellectual historian of modern India and Pakistan. Amar is interested in ideas that continue to shape contemporary politics in both countries, and his research focuses on anti-colonial nationalism, religious politics, and the secular state. He read history at University College London before going to Balliol College, Oxford, for his master's in South Asian history, and in 2019 he completed his DPhil in history at Merton College, University of Oxford. The dissertation has since been published as a monograph, The Muslim Secular Parity and the Politics of India's Partition, Oxford University Press, which is the subject of today's discussion. Amar is also working on a second book, which we're hoping we'll get a bit of a teaser into later today. Meanwhile, we also have Vanya Vaidehi Bhargav, who's an intellectual historian of modern South Asia. She completed her DPhil also at the University of Oxford at St. Anthony's College, and her research has been published in leading peer-reviewed journals like the Journal of Asian Studies, Global Intellectual History, Studies in Indian Politics and Religions. She's been a research fellow at the M.S. Marian Tagore International Center of Advanced Studies in New Delhi, and a senior research fellow at the Humanities for Advanced Studies at the University of Leipzig. And in very exciting news, she will be starting soon as assistant professor at the National Law School in Bangalore. So over to you, Amar and Vanya, if we do 15 minutes each, and then we'll go to your discussants, who I will introduce shortly. Do you have a preference for which one of you would like to start?
I think I'll go first.
Okay.
Yeah. So firstly, thank you, Udit and Ruchna, for this opportunity. Alice also for organizing this book discussion, and also thank you very much, Ali and Thomas, for very kindly agreeing to be panelists for this discussion. I'm really happy to be part of this event alongside Amar, who has been a friend and intellectual peer for, I think, now 10 years. And our projects really developed and grew in conversation with each other. As students of Faisal Devji, we very quickly realized that we were interested in, intellectual history, questions of nationalism, religion, culture, history, questions of minority and majority. But we also started to realize that our projects were also developing in different directions in some ways. Amar was focusing on three figures, I was focusing on one. There were also different types of political actors and thinkers. I was getting interested in the fluidity and change and the internal tensions within Lajpat Rai. Amar's project had different aims. And also we had lots of conversations about what is the best way to do intellectual history. So how much to contextualize ideas and what that does to intellectual history. So I'm very happy that our finished products are being put into formal dialogue with each other, and hopefully it can be the start of a new conversation. So yeah, real pleasure to be part of this event, and look forward to the discussion afterwards. And I think, yeah, with that, I'll just quickly start so that we can get to it. So Lala Lajpat Rai is often remembered as a stalwart of radical anti-colonial nationalism who sacrificed his life for India's freedom. But over the years, he has also become known in another avatar as an ideological ancestor of Hindutva, the Hindu nationalist ideology elaborated by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar in his 1923 tract Hindutva, Who is a Hindu? proponents of Hindutva today make an assertive claim on Lajpat Rai as one of their own. Interestingly, this claim is affirmed by historical scholarship, which interprets him either as articulating an earlier embryonic form of Savarkarite Hindutva, or more straightforwardly as sharing strong continuities with it. Being Hindu, Being Indian examines Lajpat Rai's nationalist thought over 4 intellectual phases of his active political life from the 1880s to 1928 and contests this dominant interpretation of Rai's nationalism. Here, I will focus on Rai's second, third, and fourth phase. I argue that even when Lajpat Rai articulated his most robust Hindu nationalism in the second phase of his life, he diverged from Savarkar's Hindutva in significant ways. For Savarkar, 3 essentials had to be met to be part of the Hindu or Hindutva nation, for him, the only nation of India. First, one had to be born in and love the Indian fatherland. Second, one had to possess Hindu blood and be part of the so-called Hindu race. But these were insufficient criteria to belong to the Hindu nation. For Savarkar, India's Muslims and Christians could be born in India and love it. And since he considered them to be descendants of Aryans who'd merely converted to Islam and Christianity, he even saw them as possessing Hindu blood. Despite meeting these 2 essentials of Hindutva, Muslims and Christians couldn't be included by Savarkar in India's Hindu nation because, according to him, they didn't meet the third key essential, partaking in and revering Hindu culture. The majority of India's Muslims and Christians couldn't be included into the Hindu nation because they had supposedly disowned Hindu culture, which Savarkar defined as India's national cultural essence. In his 1909 speech to the Punjab Hindu Sabha, cited by scholars as evidence for his pivotal role in birthing the Hindu nationalism that eventually flowered into Hindutva, Rai indeed articulated a strong notion of a Hindu nation. Hindus, within whom he, like Savarkar, included Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains, were a nation, he said, because they shared a common Hindu culture. Making Hindu culture the core of the Hindu nation, Lajpat Rai's Hindu nationalism converged with Savarkarite Hindutva. In holding that the Hindu nation was partly crystallized in Hindu historical resistance to the foreign Muslim enemy, it shared ground with it. Like Savarkar, Rai also viewed Hindus and Muslims as religiously and culturally separate nationalities. Yet, Rai imagined a politically cooperative, even if friction-ridden, relationship between these nationalities within a common state. His ability to see the Muslim nation as existing robustly alongside the Hindu nation was different from Savarkar's demand that to become part of the Hindu nation, Muslims and Christians had to abandon their religion and cultures and assimilate into Hindu culture. Rai's Hindu nationalism did not demand religious abandonment or cultural assimilation from India's Muslims and Christians. It lacked Savarkarite Hindutva's desire for Hindu cultural supremacy and its aversion to religio-cultural diversity, instead entailing a basic respect for India's diversity. In 1909, Lajpat Rai contemplated proportionate Muslim reservations. Rai neither labored to link India specially to Hindu culture, nor claimed that India was a land belonging only to Hindus, a contrast to Savarkar's slogan of Hindustan Hinduon ka. So Lajpat Rai's Hindu nationalism may have been drawn upon later by Savarkarite Hindu nationalism, but it has to be understood independently of it. Then in 1915, with the beginning of the third phase in Lajpat Rai's political life, in response to changes in global, Indian, and personal contexts, the outbreak of the First World War, the reorientation of India's Muslim leadership, and Rai's exile in America, Lajpat Rai shifted from often viewing Hindus and Muslims as separate religious nationalities to now firmly viewing them as members of a single Indian nation. Between 1915 and 1919, Rai elaborated a richly textured Indian nationalist narrative. In some of his writings during this period, Lajpat Rai went to great lengths to prove the common Indian nationhood of Hindus and Muslims. He proclaimed that Hindus and Muslims belonged to a common Aryan-Mongolian mixed race. that India's public national culture be a pluralist blend of Hinduism and Islam, and that Hindustani in both scripts be India's national language. Inspired by America, he suggested federalism as a solution to India's religio-cultural diversity. Given the presence of Muslim-majority provinces in India, federalism meant support for Muslim cultural autonomy. Rai also interpreted India's medieval history during these years, countering portrayals of medieval India as a period of foreign Muslim rule marked by domination, oppression, and conflict. The period of so-called Muslim rule was reimagined as one of indigenous Indian Muslim rule, involving Hindu-Muslim interaction, political fairness, religious tolerance and concord between Hindus and Muslims, and even exemplifying virtuous Indian governance. Whether or not Hindutva further developed the Hindu national ideas articulated earlier by Lajpat Rai, his own Hindu nationalism gave way to a rich, distinctive, composite Indian nationalist narrative. Indeed, Lajpat Rai's new Indian nationalism led him to support the Khilafat movement led by Gandhi and a section of India's Muslim leadership. This movement aimed to preserve the boundaries of the Ottoman Caliphate Empire in the face of European plans to divide it up following Turkey's defeat in World War I, and also keep Islam's holy places under the Ottoman Caliph's custody. For Rai, now Hindu-Muslim unity was the foundation of Indian Swaraj and a moral and political principle to be pursued for its own sake. So he urged Hindus to support their Muslim brothers on the Khilafat question. Hindus had to support the Khilafat cause even if it was a religious cause confined only to Muslims. Hindus had a duty to respect Muslim religious sentiments and had to support the Khilafat as trustees of Islam. Hindus had to support the Khilafat question because any question affecting India's Muslims was a national question for India's Hindus. Any offense to India's Muslims was an offense to India's Hindus. Rai also saw the Ottoman Caliphate Empire as India's guardian ally against an increasingly expansionist Europe. Savarkarite Hindutva saw Muslim devotion to holy sites outside India and the existence of a Muslim world as dividing Indian Muslim loyalty to India. In contrast, Rai dismissed fears of pan-Islamism as a British creation to divide Indians and welcomed it as having galvanized India's Muslims into Indian nationalist politics. He saw Indian Muslim sympathies with the Ottoman Caliphate Empire as coexisting with their commitment to the Indian nation. Clearly, pigeonholing Lajpat Rai's thought as Hindu nationalism has obscured a juncture when such Hindu political figures enthusiastically supported pan-Islamism as compatible with Indian nationalism. Finally, the book argues that in the fourth and final phase of his life, in the mid-1920s, and in the violent aftermath of the Khilafat movement's decline, Lajpat Rai joined the Hindu Mahasabha to organize a Hindu communal politics aimed at inaugurating a secular Indian nation state. Rai indeed organized a militant Hindu politics to oppose Muslim demands for separate electorates and communal representation. He did so because now, in the new mid-1920s context of unprecedented Hindu-Muslim rioting and polarization, he concluded that these violated the secular preconditions necessary for a united Indian nation. Rai rejected Hindu theocracy or a state with Hinduism as the official privileged religion as inappropriate for a religiously diverse India. However, this diversity was seen as now causing relentless conflict. And he held that India had to now follow the West and separate religion from politics so Hindus and Muslims could unite as members of the Indian nation. Lajpat Rai dreamt of a radically secular state and politics as a crucial foundation of a united, stable Indian nation. But his secularism, in fact, came closer to American secularism, where the state maintains a wall of separation from religion, neither hindering nor helping it, but granting full religious freedom as a constitutional right to all communities. In fact, Rai was willing to go beyond this American-style secularism to grant proportionate Muslim reservations. Indeed, much of the fury of Rai's Hindu politics was often aimed at preventing the extension of Muslim communal representation beyond their numbers in India's population. Serial riots in the 1920s, the riot in the Kohat district of Muslim-majority Northwest Frontier Province, which was followed by Kohat's entire Hindu minority population being evacuated by the British government, Rai's own Hindu minority status in Muslim-majority Punjab, the unraveling of the 1916 Lucknow Pact between the Congress and the Muslim League, and the centrifugal tendencies unleashed in Indian politics by the 1919 Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, produced in Rai fears that Muslim demands for increased adequate representation were possibly ploys to institute Muslim minority domination. Rai's Hindu politics sought to keep communal representation to what he considered reasonable limits. To be sure, Rai defined these reasonable limits in terms of Muslim representation in proportion to their numbers in India's population. Anything above that was seen to encroach upon the political rights of the Hindu majority, which had to be defended even violently if necessary. Yet Rai's secularism was not based on a desire for Hindu majority domination. This is evident when he stated, quote, "To the Hindus I will say, if there are any among you who still dream of a Hindu Raj in this country, who think that they can crush the Mussalmans and be the supreme power in this land, tell them that they are fools, or to be more accurate, that they are insane, and that their insanity will ruin their Hinduism along with their country." End quote. Rai's secularism did not privilege Hinduism as state religion. It defined as a citizen every person who was born and whose father was either born or naturalized within the territorial limits of the Commonwealth, thus delinking citizenship from religion. Rai's secularism granted religious freedom to all, advocated Hindustani as India's national language, and accepted federalism, and as his active support for the 1928 Nehru Report shows, also proportionate Muslim reservations at the central and state levels. These were political mechanisms that checked Hindu majoritarianism. Rajpat Rai articulated a Hindu communal politics and secularism, and yet his secularism was not reducible to Hindu majoritarianism. It continued to hold a positive significance for minorities. But equally, Rai's secular communal position was ultimately an untenable one. His Hindu communalism threatened to undermine his secularism, rendering it unstable and fragile. To conclude, this book uses Rai's thought to make broader analytical arguments. One about the need to recognize internal differentiation within Hindu nationalism. All Hindu nationalisms aren't the same as Hindutva. Second, about the need to pay closer attention to the nuances, shifts, fluidity, and internal tensions within a politician thinker's thought. And finally, Hindu politics and secularism can be expressed together and share ground. But this does not necessarily reduce that secularism to Hindu majoritarianism. While often the secular-sounding language of separating religion and politics is used instrumentally to conceal ideological projects of majority domination and undermine secularism's core aim of opposing inter-religious domination, in some cases, one can have an insecure Hindu politics seeking to establish a secularism which rests on an attachment to a Hindu majority, but still opposes dreams of Hindu supremacy and domination, rejects the notion of the state privileging Hinduism and Hindus, emphasizes equal citizenship regardless of religion, which respects diversity and can even consider Muslim political reservations. But equally, that a hyphenated secular communal position is ultimately an untenable one, since Hindu communalism threatens to undermine the core values underlying secularism, such as peace, tolerance, and fraternity. So even as we rightly reject assumptions of mutual exclusivity between Hindu majoritarian communal politics and secularism, we must resist current scholarly tendencies to read secularism as little more than thinly veiled Hindu majoritarianism. Rai's untenable hyphenated secular communal position shows that we must continue to retain analytical distinctions between secularism and Hindu majoritarian communalism. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Vanya. Uh, I realized, embarrassingly, I forgot to say a very important thing in your bio, which is Vanya has recently published a fantastic book, Being Hindu, Being Indian, Lala Lajpat Rai's Idea of Nationhood. I don't think I need to say more because the last 15 minutes have been a fantastic advertisement for this book. Thank you so much. Uh,
Thank you.
we now move on to Amar, who will be introducing his book on the Muslim secular. Over to you, Amar.
Thank you very much, Udit, and to Rochna for having us this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be with you guys and also with Ali and with Thomas. I mean, all of your work has been informative of my own, so it's a great privilege for me to be here with you, or with all four of you, and of course with Vanya, who's already said that we've had a decade of dialogue about political ideas and political thinking, and that's really come through in these books, I think, and hopefully we'll pick that up in the discussion. So without further ado, I'll crack on with the kind of broad outline of the book and some of the big arguments that I'm trying to make. So in many ways, it kind of begins where Vanya's ends, in the interwar period. So um, during the era of decolonization, partitions emerged as the victorious solution for forestalling the supposed tyranny of numbers, not just in Hindu majority India in 1947, but also a year later in Palestine and earlier in Ireland. After the Second World War, the idea of devolving sovereignty to a minority was also being considered again in Europe. The categories of the decolonizing world, therefore, were not exceptional to it. But this book represents instead an effort to read the Indian history of decolonization against the grain, if you like, to excavate from the subject position of minority a generalizable political theory for shared sovereignty and inclusive nationalism. And I want to suggest that the minor allows us to think of the major not just as an antagonistic entity that is set against it, but to which it can belong and uniquely complete. For while the undertaking of unity tasks the majority to first make an appeal to the minority, ultimately it is for the minority to decide whether or not to uphold any such appeal. So secularism as a modern ideal, whatever its origins, has to do with the nation state's management of religious plurality and the preparedness of its diverse citizenry to find ways of living together amicably. And I want to argue that Indian Muslim politics, so often associated with the triumphant movement for a separate Pakistan led by Jinnah, was not just capable of theorizing the secular, its minoritarian subject position meant that it was best positioned to do so. Because provided that they do not wish to become majorities themselves, secularism remains for mostly the prerogative of religious minorities across the world. While Indian secularism as a tradition boasts of prominent Hindu ideologues, namely Gandhi and Nehru, questions of neutrality and toleration were existential for their Muslim peers in more direct ways. So mine, therefore, is not a deeply identitarian argument, but a structural one about the very workings of politics. Situating my historical subjects in their debate with Jinnah, I excavate this Muslim secular from the archives of three eminent anti-colonial thinkers, the Sunni theologian and India's first education minister, Abul Kalam Azad, and the leading mid-century nationalists of Kashmir and the Pashtun frontier, Sheikh Abdullah and Abdul Ghaffar Khan. After the First World War, most claims to freedom in the imperial world adopted the ascendant language of national self-determination. For these pious Muslim thinkers, this had to be reconciled with the universalism of Islam, which upheld the unity of a single human race sustained by God. By dividing the world into confrontational groups, territorial nationalism, as it was originally theorized in Europe, provided its antithesis. But in contrast to Muslim thinkers like Iqbal and Maududi, who, for albeit different reasons, rejected the national idea outright, the subjects of my book reoriented it. First, by replacing its apparent racial chauvinism with a combination of domestic pride and international curiosity, and second, by emphasizing its democratic spirit of popular sovereignty, which finally reversed the arbitrary rule of kings. In effect, these Muslims smuggled their non-national Islamic concepts into a negotiated endorsement of India as a nation state. By retaining the integrities of Hinduism and Islam, here Indian national unity is set up to resist homogenization. The content of an interactive shared nationalism, therefore, is produced outside the autonomous realm of religious practice. This extra religious interaction opened Indians to a common nationality founded upon things like pre-colonial inheritance, uh, oriented around things like literature, art, and food and dress, and other things, of course. But as well as that, a collection of ethnic linguistic particularities dotted across the country, and finally, reciprocal ethical agreements between Hindu and Muslim groups in the face of colonial violence. So I'm calling then for a significant realigning of global Islam as a category and not just Indian Islam. Because today, when Islam has assumed a position as the religious in many secular Western societies, our international debate about its relationship with the non-religious state is saturated by the modest concerns of Islamism. If politics is determined by our ability to think and act freely in the temporal world, Islamism is anti-political, for it gives sovereignty up to God and is interested not in any vast human agency, but in maintaining the supremacy of theology in everyday life. I think then that its critical engagement with secularism rests merely on the demand that it safeguard the freedom and integrity of Islam. My point then is that there exists, beyond these narrow confines, a deeper engagement with pluralism, which prompts Islam to have grander ambitions than simply its own preservation. The Muslim secular is instead concerned with how its pious constituents partake in a cohesive, multi-religious society, as opposed to resigning themselves to a cultural apartheid, if you like. So Jinnah's demand for Pakistan also represented a secular politics of sorts. From around 1937, Jinnah channeled the collapse of the League of Nations and its language of minority rights to elevate the Muslim minority to the insurmountable rank of a sovereign national majority. But once secularism is provided with its thicker definition of state neutrality and cultures of toleration, it becomes, I think, increasingly unsuitable for Jinnah and appropriate instead for his opponents. This was because he could scarcely theorize coexistence at any length when his efforts were directed at the opposite task of unpicking Muslims from Hindus to render them sovereign equals. And Islam, though an under-theorized category for the irreligious Jinnah, was nevertheless the binding agent for his Muslim nation. If the theological led Azad to the secular, the reverse was true for Jinnah. Azad's Muslim universalism generated an interactive secular Indian nationalism, while Jinnah's temporal concerns produced a political theology of a different kind. Contesting Jinnah's logic, Azad claimed that Muslims, given their intrinsic strength as a social unit, were only ever a nominal minority in India. The world's largest concentration of Muslims, with majorities in 5 of India's 12 provinces, their sheer size assured, he thought, certain influence. Moreover, unlike India's Hindus, who were fragmented by, quote, social and racial divisions, its 95 million Muslims were united by an egalitarian, quote, Islamic Brotherhood. And so this amounted not only to an acknowledgement of the hierarchical caste divisions found within the Hindu majority, which, according to Azad, made its political consolidation so unlikely, it also represented an elite upper caste denial of such petrified discrimination and of any meaningful interdenominational conflict among Muslims too, right? Nevertheless, important here is that Hindu disunity and Muslim ecumenism, however real or imagined, were summoned to neuter any majority-minority binary, right? So, this formation or formulation is much more than simply, elite posturing, if you like. So Abdullah and Ghaffar Khan, meanwhile, unlike Azad, came from areas in India's northwest, where 90% of the population was Muslim. Thus, for these two men, the threat of Hindu domination had little meaning. In fact, by anchoring Muslim cultural expression so squarely within regional Kashmiri and Pashtun identities, Abdullah and Ghaffar Khan were able to transcend religious division at the national level. In effect, they localized or territorialized Islamic notions of the moral community and its consensus or ijma. And so by settling the vexing question of Muslim self-statement prior to any discussion about Indianness, the grander national space is largely cleared of religious competition. Consequently, it is more easily made the site for an unshackled association with Hindus, at least theoretically. And in fact, Islamic concepts notably of the anti-colonial jihad, were then able to serve not an exclusive Muslim project, but an inclusive Indian one. And it was by refusing to fully secularize their Kashmiri and Pashtun subnations that they were, somewhat counterintuitively, able to champion a supra-secular nationalism for all of India. Rather than posing a threat to Indian nationalism, these Muslim regionalisms can be deeply held and yet remain firmly within its ambit because they, at least originally, and that's crucial, at least originally, do not make claims to absolute sovereignty. So Abdullah and Ghaffar Khan, somewhat differently to Azad, also found another place to establish religion beyond the national space. Hinduism and Islam were such formidable social facts that they did not require sovereignty. But demography was not all that led these men to reject partition. Just as important were the negative social costs that they perceived of two diametrically opposed religious nations confronting one another. By forcibly delinking Hindu from Muslim in every possible way, these three men suggested that partition's unavoidable violence was destined to turn India's imperfect social equilibrium, both resilient and unstable in equal measure, into something worse, irreversible antagonism. Animated by a deep historicity, the Muslim secular recognized not just the shift in historical time from imperial to popular rule, but that enmity as much as amity had long defined the volatile familial relationship between Hindus and Muslims. And some of you will notice the dialogue here with Shruti Kapala's work. So to allow amity to flourish in this imperfect scenario, ethical Indians had to find a way of allaying enmity as much as was possible, according to these figures. So Faisal Devji has shown that Jinnah, meanwhile, was an anti-historical thinker. Hindus and Muslims were so intertwined in history that Jinnah duly deleted the past to finally disentangle them for a new social contract between equals. But according to his three opponents, engineering a permanent division, as Jinnah straightforwardly suggested, was as naive as it was unnecessary. That would fracture this delicately poised but nevertheless integral society and fan the flames of enmity which, in Ghaffar Khan's words, would, quote, spread in a wild blaze to finally consume, unquote, amity altogether. For Jinnah, only Muslim sovereignty could secure minority rights and thus peace in South Asia. However, I want to suggest that the Muslim secular fully embraced the historical loss of Muslim sovereignty to enable its productive engagement with Indian democracy. In medieval and early modern Indian history, sovereignty was divided within and between empires, even at the height of Mughal rule. But if pre-colonial power was pluralized in this way, Muslims still exercised a disproportionate amount of it and headed the most powerful states of that period. And so my point is that by willfully foregoing this former dominance when thinking about modern forms of democratic power, our three anti-colonial thinkers struck a rare compact with loss for a peaceful future. We've already seen that the Muslim secular housed some significant Muslim regional constituencies within its Indian democracy. These constituencies were not required to entirely relinquish their own claims to political power, and yet, in the interest of both the larger Muslim minority to which they belonged and to Indian society as a whole, they had to ultimately fold these claims into a new conception of shared Indian sovereignty. So the Muslim secular recalibrated its inheritances of Muslim political power for a democratic age in which all citizens and communities were of the same value. This was the mandatory right to be performed by Muslims for the preservation of Indian social equanimity. But this right ought not to be mistaken as sacrificial, for the strong were not foregoing something they had attached great contemporary value to, but were rather actively stretching for what they now truly desired, the grander modern prize of democratic freedom and peace. In this way, then, Azad, Abdullah, and Ghaffar Khan understood the structural truism with which I began this talk. While a majority must create the conditions for unity, only a willing minority could actuate it by uniquely transcending itself. This foundational embrace of loss then played a considerable role in elevating the Muslim secular to a distinctive democratic theory, but so too did the concept of parity. And I'll end with this concept. So intensifying their refusal of minorityhood, Azad, Abdullah, and Ghaffar Khan elevated Muslims to positions from which they could be equalized with the Hindu majority. Whether they spoke of India's historic common culture, especially true of Azad, or the ethical partnerships that would liberate it from colonialism, especially Abdul Ghaffar Khan, these men generated a national idea for which the Muslim was as crucial as the Hindu. So, like its favorable demographics, the Muslim minority's disproportionate significance to Indian social life similarly averted its national marginalization, a concern which their allies Gandhi and Nehru, as Hindus, had less reason to confront. Yet parity as a concept has been associated not with social arguments for India's unity at all, but Jinnah's legal demand that it be replaced by two sovereign nations. However, insofar as they refused to be classified as an uninfluential minority and remained interested in an overt kind of equalization with Hindus as Muslims, Jinnah's Muslim opponents shared a language with him. Surpassing the liberal majoritarian understanding of equality as the plain abstract equivalence that exists between individual citizens, both tried to equalize Indians without undermining their religious identities. Though they did not imagine a new separate Muslim society as Jinnah did, his opponents used a similar idiom to affirm the culture of the existing shared one, right? To preserve, if you like, the influential place of Muslims within it. Muslim political thought in India, therefore, I think, coheres around its challenge to the tendency of liberal equality to ignore and even assimilate difference. I think that's a particularly crucial point. The Muslim secular imagined the jointly created Indian nationality, which defined Hindus and Muslims not by their unequal numbers, but by their equal value. But because Indians had been awarded this common rank without deleting their religious individualities, they were not the same as, but were placed on a par with each other. They were alike in many respects, but they were not identical. So parity then is an especially useful concept because it positivizes at once both commonality and distinction. And in this way, the Muslim secular produced a thicker definition, I think, of parity than Jinnah, who was only ever interested in the second part of this equation, i.e. distinction, right? So, but having said all of that, parity is also the conceptual force by which the Muslim secular pushes Indian national democratic theory to new limits, right? So, and in that way, although there are, of course, great dissimilarities, it is not entirely unlike Ambedkar's call for affirmative action. So in sum then, if the Muslim secular admonishes its foes, not just Pakistan, but also today's ascendant Hindu nationalism and Hindutva as it's theorized by Savarkar, as Vanya outlined, the Muslim secular also and simultaneously lays down a challenge, I think, for its intellectual friends, namely Gandhi and Nehru. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Amar. As I was listening to the two of you, I was reminded, when Vanya was talking about we shouldn't think of nationalism, religious nationalism, and secularism as mutually exclusive, or indeed Amar's idea of interactive secularism and parity. We had Professor Rajiv Bhargav at one of our book events just a few months ago, again talking about why mutual exclusion is not the right way of thinking of Indian secularism. And I'm guessing we'll have occasion to talk about the kind of contemporary theoretical implications of both your accounts in due course. But before I launch into that, we have two excellent discussants joining us today. We've got Professor Thomas Hansen, who is the Reliance Dhirubhai Ambani Professor of Anthropology at Stanford. He founded and directed Stanford Center for South Asia from 2010 to 2017. He's written extensively on Hindu nationalism, Hindu-Muslim conflicts, and urban politics in India, as well as memory and cultural politics in post-apartheid South Africa. He's the author of various books, Law of Force, The Violent Heart of Indian Politics, The Saffron Wave, Democracy and Hindu Nationalism in Modern India, Wages of Violence, Naming and Identity in Post-Colonial Bombay, Cool Passion, The Political Theology of Modern Convictions, and also the editor of various edited collections. We've also got joining us Dr. Ali Usman Qasmi, who's Associate Professor in History at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS in Lahore, where he's been since January 2012. He received his PhD from the South Asia Institute of Heidelberg University in March 2009, And before joining LUMS, Ali was a Newton Fellow for postdoctoral research at Royal Holloway at the University of London. He's also published extensively in reputed academic journals like Modern Asian Studies and the Journal of Islamic Studies, and he is the author of Questioning the Authority of the Past, the Al-Quran Movements in Punjab, published by Oxford University Press in 2011, and a second book monograph, The Ahmadis and Politics of Religious Exclusion in Pakistan, was the recipient of the Karachi Literature Festival Peace Prize 2015. He's also edited various edited volumes. We're very, very honored to have you both, Thomas and Ali. I don't have an order for you, so I will let you fight it out as to which one of you will go first.
No, I can go first. I think Thomas should be concluding, if that's okay for him. And first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a great honor to be present at this book launch. Both these books are great new additions to this thriving, exciting new field of Indian political thought as to how it's expanding our understanding of conceiving notions of self, nationhood, sovereignty, secularism, so on and so forth. Now, coming to these two books, and I can start with Vanya's book first. And in fact, both these books, they need to be studied together. And in a way, to put it lightly, both these books seem to refer to, like, can a secular be a Hindu and can a Muslim be a secular, right? So these are the overarching themes, and what is the kind of the nature of the political project that emerges as a result of a secular asserting their Hinduness and a Muslim asserting their secularness, right? So I also believe that in a way, one of the reasons as to how I read Vanya's project, it's this tension between an avowed Hindu nationalism and claims to Indian secularity, and the urgency of this urgency is shaped by the political contingency of Indian secularism under threat, in the sense and the charges of its supposedly anti-Hindu kind of like outlook, and hence the need for making this position that there is a possibility for an embrace of Hinduness, or an articulation of some kind of a Hindu identity. And in this articulation, it is Lala Lajpat Rai's version of being Hindu that is more compatible with the project of Indian secularism, right? So I'll start by making a comparison and drawing some of the theoretical interventions which were made by William Gould in his book, and Vanya has also referred to him, because William Gould's work on the 1920s and 1930s India and its politics, and he refers to this internally stratified language of the nation, which is emerging from the fact that there is a new political idiom which is enabled because of the rise of mass politics and some modicum of self-rule in colonial India. And hence it sets a political platform where Congress and its allies, they are, and these Congress members themselves are at times dual members. They hold membership of Arya Samaj or Hindu Mahasabha or other organizations. And this era of mass mobilization, popular politics, responsible government, they posit or mobilize a certain kind of a new critical idiom to shape the contours of Indian nationhood. Now, in this articulation, as Gould shows in his book, there are examples and incidents which can be read as outward, which were outwardly, explicitly communalist, but they could also be misconstrued or read as communalist, right? So you can have very clear examples of communal violence or communalism in the form of tracts being written about Islam in favor of cow protection and so on and so forth. But there could also be articulation of Indian nationhood in a certain kind of a moral language, which took its inspiration from, let's say, Gita and other mythological characters and anecdotes. Now, the in both these cases, and Gold does refer to, and Vanya has also referred to that, Skinner's idea about intentionality and illocutionary force of utterance. So like how these meanings and how these idioms and how this language is being understood by the audience, right? So I mean, in case of William Gold, he does acknowledges the question of audience and reception. But I was wondering, I mean, and this is where I would like Vanya to respond as to the audience is missing from her otherwise incredibly researched and meticulous book. So while it is true that Lajpat Rai is articulating in his own mind a sense of an idea of Indian nationhood, which is accommodating of a certain kind of Muslim autonomy, but a lot of his political language is potentially read or understood by a vast audience, especially a Muslim audience, as essentially and inherently communal, right? So this gap between what Lajpat Rai is saying and how he's being understood in the larger political context, that I would like Vanya to respond to that. Secondly, I was, while I was reading her book, I could not but help think about how many similarities one could draw between Lajpat Rai and Jinnah, as well as Lajpat Rai and Iqbal. I'll come to that. I was reminded of a quote by Lajpat Rai, which was reproduced in Madhav Khosla's book, where Lajpat Rai said in 1906, "Hindus shall never cease to be Hindus, and Mohammedans shall never cease to be Mohammedans." Now, this is diametrically opposite to what Jinnah said in his very often quoted speech on 11th August 1947, where he said that Hindus shall cease to be Hindus, Muslims shall cease to be Muslims, not in a religious sense, but as citizens of the state. So in that, in that sense, both their politics is about either the impossibility or the possibility of Muslims and Hindus transcending their religious ideals and coming together as citizens, and hence engage in that kind of like electoral politics of interest. So right. So while one could say Lajpat Rai had little faith in that kind of transcendence to occur, Jinnah, by the end of his political career, believed that this could be a possibility. Now, one important point that Vanya is making is, which could have been done, I think, in a bit more detail, is about a lot of his politics, Lajpat Rai's politics, it emanates from his identity as a Punjabi Hindu, where he himself was a minority. And hence, the reason why he is seeking this kind of like an organic unity. And he's looking for that supra-theological language, which Vanya identifies in this Vedic-centric identity, which is still different from Savarkar's Hindutva, which is a more kind of like a forceful or a violent embrace of the non-Hindu. But yet, he wants to anchor that identity in something which is more firmly rooted. And this is where, again, there is a comparison to be drawn with Iqbal, who is similarly seeking an organic unity of sorts for the Muslim identity, and both of them are operating from the peculiar context of Punjab, where the Muslim had a kind of an uncomfortable majority, where the claim, the numerical claim of 56% did not match the economic status of Muslims, and this perpetual tension, which the Muslims were asserting in the form of a movement back then called the 56% movement, the 56% movement, that we are 56%, and hence our political power, our number, our majority, our numerical value needs to be understood and to be recognized. And this is where as Vanya says, that Rai could understand as to what it means to be a minority, what it means to be, have anxiety about that minority, and also and hence the distinction, as she says, between democracy and majoritarian domination. But at the same time, taking cue from this Muslim assertion of consolidating Muslim majority in Punjab, similar thing could be said about Rai's insistence that while there could be an accommodation of these different cultural autonomous nations, but the Hindu majority must be recognized at an all India level. So in many ways, all these thinkers, even though they come from apparently very different kinds of backgrounds, have some shared ideas, some shared concerns. Right. And lastly, I mean, I would like to point out, these perilous intimacies or dangerous intimacies, and the need to, again, the indistinguishability at some level. And Vanya has done a fantastic job highlighting the differences between what Lajpat Rai is saying and how it's different from Savarkar. And yet, you do find this need for a justified kind of a violence in the name of self-defense as legitimate. And while it is not, it cannot be described as militarism or aggression or violence, but it's and most of it emanates from, it's set in the context of the very important cohort incident which took place in the 1920s. But it becomes difficult to draw that kind of a clear distinction where whether it is a violence for the sake of consolidation or self-defense, and where it to draw this boundary with the way in which Savarkar is talking about it, and similarly at the same time when Savarkar is talking about being Hindu in a cultural sense, where a Muslim or a Christian could also be potentially racially and by blood be a Hindu, and also the fact that they shared a certain kind of a ritual practice, according to him, where they could also qualify. So towards the end, as Vanya has shown, the three phases of Lajpat Rai's career as to how he defines and he develops his ideas of Indian nationhood. But by the end of it, there is he had discarded the idea that India there were two cultural nations and there was only one single cultural nation. So it does beg this question of how much of this one cultural Indian nation was predominantly, inflected with Hindu rituals and Hindu idioms, right? So again, talking from the perspective of the audience, and which was in dialogue with Lajpat Rai and his politics, as to how they perceive this politics. So I hope these points make some sense. Amar is, and I thoroughly enjoyed engaging with this. It's a very dense reading. And again, starting off with a lighter note, I noticed that he referred to these thinkers mostly by their grand titles like Fakhre-Aghwan, Sher-e-Kashmir, Qaid-e-Azam, but he did not refer to Azad as Imamul Hind. So I wonder why. Anyways, so it's in this. So one of the earliest sort of like one of the questions which I am trying to figure out an answer for is oh wow, already 2 minutes. That like what is the secular in it, right? So you talk about the like how Azad is instantiating humanist traditions of Islam in the nation itself, and upholding the truth of insaniyat. But is it in that sense, like how is it not Islamic cosmopolitanism? How is it not Islamic universalism at play? Why is it that you think that it's only by secularizing religion or the language of Islam in a secular idiom that as if it becomes more plural and tolerant, right? So if maybe that's not the implication, but that's how I think it can be. And so in a way, it's important to then make this distinction between as to why is it being called Muslim secular? Why is it not being framed as Islamic cosmopolitanism. And second point, which I wanted to make is, we talk about that these thinkers, they provide a third way to conceive Indian nationalism. And you do point out the distinctions, the variations in their thought and their backgrounds, but I would urge you to take that distinction more, in more detail, right? And as you pointed out in your introduction as well, that both Bacha Khan and Sheikh Abdullah, they are comfortable with their national Muslim majority in their respective Pashtun and Kashmiri identities. But at the same time, so like, what difference does it make? So in the sense that so what needs to then read other national kind of like national majorities in Punjab and Bengal as to the uneasiness of that majority in Punjab and Bengal, it means that made it difficult for that kind of a conversation at the national level, as you pointed out, that because they were comfortably suited in their own respective regions, so hence they could go beyond the religious, and intuitively then create the possibility for a dialogue along the lines of the national. But at the same time, and lastly, and this is where I will conclude, it's the notion of sovereignty. It seems to me that you are referring to nationalism without sovereignty, or sovereignty without sovereign claims without statehood, as if in these projects, both Bacha Khan and Sheikh Abdullah are willing to let go of that sovereign nationhood, and for inaugurating this Indian state project of secularism, where the non-national or the non-sovereign can become part of that equation, and hence it is. But yeah, so I mean, the collapse of the negotiations, or the impossibility of that kind of Indian republic to emerge because of partition, it's perhaps not the only reason why this distinctness of Mulk Kashmir as a viable national Muslim category, and Larobar Afghan as a viable national Muslim category emerge. I'm trying to argue, and perhaps you can comment on that, they always prefaced their kind of politics and their thought, and hence it was not a surrender of these ideals or of these sovereignties. I'm so sorry I took so long. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Thanks, Ali. We'll move on to Thomas.
Sure, thank you very much. I will also try to stick to time. Please send me a note if I go over. So I also want to join Ali in congratulating both the authors for these two really wonderful books and real additions to this burgeoning field. And it's been really interesting to read them alongside each other. And I understand from your preface and so on that some of this work has also been done and been discussed extensively over a decade in various watering holes in Oxford and elsewhere. So I think one can tell that there is a conversation going. So in that spirit, I'll offer some comments that kind of cuts across both books at the same time. And I cannot do justice to everything that are in these books. They're great. But here we go. So first, let me begin with a kind of more sort of maybe high-level comment. It's clear that when you read these two books together and think of these two thinkers together, both Lajpat Rai and Azad and many others at the time and now rely on some critical distinctions between the sphere of politics, broadly speaking, and spheres of social habits and cultural values, and thirdly, a sphere of religion. So these distinctions are these are assumptions of spheres that are real, that exist in the world, and can be used also as political and intellectual categories. For Azad, it was a shared Hindustani culture and language that made it possible to imagine a robust Indian nationalism that would reside in the realm of politics as an alliance and political unity of people historically accustomed to each other, but also capable of recognizing each other's deep differences at the level of religion. In this vision, nationhood is based on a shared watan that has become a homeland also for those who came to the country through the lives and deaths of many generations of otherwise distinct communities and people. However, the religious sphere is never shared or even shareable, really, and Assad is consistently quiet on issues of conversion, of intermarriages, and of course on caste and other social hierarchies that appear, in fact, central and integral to this shared culture. Similarly, Lajpat Rai makes a clear distinction between the political, which he sees as the proper place of nationalism, at least in part of his work, part of his many phases he goes through. That foreground, this is especially true when he comes back from America, where the political is the proper place of nationalism that foregrounds the principle of self-determination by Indians. And on the other hand, another sphere of social, cultural, and religious lives of both Hindus and especially Hindus, but also Muslims, that he sees as relatively separate. Although Rai at times seemed to be sympathetic to the idea of what Amar in his book calls a shared profane culture, he was as adamant as Azad about the absolute separation of the religious spheres of Hindus and Muslims, and the need, as Ali mentioned, of Hindus to be able to and indeed need to defend their own community and community life with violence if possible. So while Rai is not a Hindu nationalist in Savarkar sense, as Vanya argues rightly, let us not forget at the level of political practice, the notion of Sangathan, of organizing and strengthening something called Hindu society, a term that rises at this point in the late 19th century, was at the heart of the Arya Samaj project, the Gurukuls, the Akharas, they were all critical precursors to the later RSS project of Shakars and muscular Hindutva. Arya Samaj networks, as we know, were also the main recruiting grounds of Hindu nationalism across North India through much of the 20th century. So Rai's assumption that community, in this sense of the defending the community, his assumption was that community identification and indeed Sangathan organization would translate into political identity as well. And I think as Vanya shows very well, Rai vacillates across these two notions of what constitutes the political, either as a form of aggregated and abstracted community sentiment grounded in religion more narrowly defined, or as this broader, more general identification with the principle of self-rule of all people living on the land that would allow for a unified nationalism grounded in some form of political bond, that is, some form of acknowledgement of the neighbor and the other, even if socially inferior, as parts of the same nation. So when we look at it this way, you can say it's clear that Assad's idea of nationalism as a political bond between otherwise different people was not fundamentally different from Rai's, except in its more differentiated division of the social into a sphere of religion that was beyond dispute, and here maybe mirroring Macaulay's principle in the Indian Penal Code of that outlawed offense to religious sentiment, and one that is cultural, that is habits and a shared culture that included language, aesthetics, art, maybe even food on festive occasions. My question for both the authors is that striking in both books, in fact, why is the idea of nationalism as a political bond that is clearly important to both these figures so relatively underdefined as a thing, as a sentiment, as a focus? Why? What is it about the political that sort of eludes them in various ways? Why is the source of cohesion or the source of the bond, possible bond, always referred back to a generalized idea and often vague idea of a shared history and a culture, but that always nonetheless veers at the edge of risking falling into the unquestionable loyalty to religious community that's also the source of endless violence? Why are there in these figures relatively few reflections on the political as such, the possibility of grounding a political bond in itself, as it were, in the sense of acknowledging the irreducible humanity and therefore rights to life and voice of fellow citizens and subjects? Is it simply because South Asian political imagination at this point is so, even as mass politics is rising, is so utterly dominated by a principle of elite representation of large numbers of people whose real proclivities could only be guessed about or fantasized about through this prism of language and of culture and religion? I think it's an open question. I mean, there is no. It's not as if the idea of a political bond as a self-grounding discourse is absent at this time, right? I mean, there's plenty of, from social contract thinking to lots of other ideas, but they don't seem to have a place in this conversation that one would expect. Now, that leads me to my second comment, which has to do with the possibility of building political identity and recognizing your neighbor and enemy in a caste society. So while neither of the three protagonists in Amar's story, Asad, Abdullah, and Kafar Khan, discuss caste as a feature of South Asian society, Lajpat Rai is deeply engaged in this question, but mostly from a classical Arya Samaj point of view of caste being an institution that weakens Hindu society through division and by losing members to other religions, and the need for offering some kind of simplified Vedic religion to the lower castes. Vanya shows that when advocating Shuddhi or reconversion of mostly lower caste and Dalit communities back into the fold, as it were, a kind of precursor for today's Karvapsi, Rai would argue vehemently against any kind of caste reform and instead insist on what was known as the horizontal approach, that is moving Dalits and other lowered caste into the same station that they had prior to their conversion. And here is my reflection and question on this. It seems to me that both Asad and Rai's approach to the possibility of coexistence of Muslims and Hindus approach the question within a frame entirely conditioned by the tacit rules of caste civility that also in part became codified in colonial law and interaction. That is, the idea that the only way to approach the neighboring community was through an a priori assumption of a certain social distance in matters of all intimate and familial matters, marriage, inheritance, food waste, domestic order, and so on, while developing forms of respect relations in public and political domains, neither deep nor brotherly, but something that would keep the peace and be a foundation for some form of alliance, however temporary or tenuous. This form of recognition does not presuppose equality in any substantive sense that we know from political theory or from a European discourse, but precisely parity that Amar talks about, some form of standing based on strength or presumed strength that could be based on numbers, social rank, or presumed degrees of community organization and cohesion, and also a formula that would leave the internal governance of communities not only intact, but also the very presupposition of their life as represented communities. The trouble with the new demands of organizing religious community at this time as forms of nations or proto-nations was precisely that it demanded some form of what Ben Anderson in 1983 called deep comradeship, that is, a form of vertical social integration that would be anathema to caste-dominant elites, except in the form of retaining numbers in the Shuddhi and Tabligh efforts. It's interesting that Asad and his friends are less concerned about their own authority as natural leaders of the Muslim community than are Rai and other Arya Samaj leaders at the time. What I'm suggesting is that the idea of Indian secularism as a balancing of interest of communities, which was the colonial promise, but only really a practice after independence, seems based on this principle of distance and non-intervention in the internal affairs of any community, religious, caste, or otherwise. I'm not talking about a private sphere in the Western sense of individual rights and property, but as community privates, that is, spheres that are close to outsiders, but open to our kind. Maybe the root of this may not be the composite culture of Hindustan, but the caste order of Hindustan. Finally, a word about the global context within which it was possible for these figures to think, imagine, and conjure up what they did. Vanya is rightly identifying several phases in Lajpat Rai's work and life: an early phase where he sees the internal social organization and representation of the Hindu community as a precondition for its political representation, and a later phase where Rai publishes and speaks about self-determination and the imperative of national education, clearly echoing people like Mazzini, Garibaldi, and he writes about these figures also in the 1890s, and even Fichte. The question is, what is it that explains these shifts and this vacillation? Similarly, Assad is changing his position from a staunch defense of the rights of Muslim representation only to the advocacy of Muslims as an integral part of the Indian nation. That the large majority that in Amar's wonderful formulation complements and also is this kind of the Indian intoxicant, right? The cigarette and the tea metaphor, which I find very charming. That makes Indian culture into a composite and truly national culture. As Amar was mentioning in his talk right now, the period we are focusing on here is where the very terms and concept of minority and majority assume their 20th century forms, the dissolution and crisis of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Tsarist Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and so on, where the rights and demands of both linguistic and religious minorities are proliferating, held against equally strong ideas of majoritarian nationalism, often grounded in language, religion, or forms of shared culture that are dominating the global political horizons. In some ways, Rai's movement from early Hindu communitarianism or Hindu nationalism before World War I to his eloquent calls for self-determination in 1918 mirror these global currents quite clearly, and it's clear that he takes inspiration from the Wilsonian doctrine of self-determination upon his return to India. Now, while the idea of political community growing organically out of ethnic, linguistic, or religious community was widely regarded as an organic and integral part of how political aspirations would develop across the world, and maybe especially in the colonial world, the racist and colonial common sense of the era also held that those political aspirations to a certain measure held them against a certain measure, which was the doctrine that was referred to at the time as the so-called standard of civilization, which was a diplomatic and political standard by which people, minorities, and nations were deemed ready for the inclusion into the hallowed hall of the nations of the world. India was the only non-sovereign territory to be included in the League of Nations at its inception, but only with limited rights. And the League of Nations was founded on the Wilsonian principle of universal self-determination, but with these crucial racist qualifications that not every people or nation was ready yet for this status. This was not only a space full of promise of an international community and international court of justice, and the ILO, for instance, and Indian officials were actually part of all this for decades, but also a place that promoted minority treaties as an active instrument, promoting minority protection and guarantees of special status or language and educational rights for linguistic or religious minorities. That was at least what was experimented with within the League. Amar mentions this, that a part of Jinnah's motivation to turn to Muslim separatism was that he felt, and others, that the promise of the League's minority treaties turned out to be only hollow, and that they were roundly ignored by many of the stronger and dominant member states. But my question is, how should we understand, and how else do these larger shifts in global context of discourse and legal frameworks affect events and thought in India? It's pretty clear that much nationalist discourse in India at the time, before and after the formation of this body of the League of Nations, aimed at arguing with and against the standard of civilization framework, trying to argue, as both Rai and Assad did, that India's history exhibited many examples of great civilization, civilized relations between communities and centuries, examples they and many others would hold up against the ample evidence of European barbarity and excessive violence. So I'll leave it at this. My question is, how do we factor in more decisively, perhaps, if relevant, and I'd like both the authors to reflect on this, how these larger intellectual and legal factors, and it's clear that both everybody under consideration in these books are well aware of all of this. How do we factor this in in how do they shape, this context shape political thought in the first half of the 20th century in India? Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Thomas and Ali. We'll go back to both our authors for very brief responses. I'm aware there's so much in those comments. We will have the chance to revisit them as the discussion continues, but we'd also like to get some of our attendees in. So if we could have maybe 3 to 5 minutes each of response from both of you, and then we'll open it up.
Sure. Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Or do you want to go first?
Anything.
Okay, I'll work my way backwards as I often do at these things. I've made quite a lot of notes, but I'll try and be as brief as possible. Thank you both for some extremely rich comments. And actually much more to think about. I'm like, should I feel like rewriting the thing now, or like writing an extra chapter maybe? I'll start with what Thomas alluded to at the end, and the context of the breakdown of the League of Nations logic around minority protection and what that means for Indian political thinking. I mean, obviously, there's a clear engagement with that very moment and that interwar crisis, if you like. And I think what's certainly key for the figures that I'm looking at is that they're almost resisting that global tide and the collapse of that of the minority category in the Indian context. They're almost saying that actually this binary of majority and minority is actually overplayed to a significant degree, especially in the Indian context when Hindus and Muslims are only nominal majorities and minorities there. And so one needs to, so if Jinnah takes the view that actually the collapse of the minority category means that Muslims must become a nation, in some sense, even though they don't like the category of minority, there's you could argue a conservative desire to retain it, so that in an organic Indian polity, in a liberal constitution, those various divisions within the Hindu majority undo the logic of majority and minority altogether. So I think there is a dialogue there, but there's also a kind of resisting which obviously fails. In a sense, you could argue that global political thought overpowers these ideas. Yeah, I mean, what was really fascinating, something that you brought out, Thomas, was this idea of history and this constant refrain of the past and the return to the past to produce the nation. But what does that really mean? You said, for a national bond that's almost under-theorized. I think that's very compelling, and especially for Azad, because for him, history is not as important as inheritance. What he means by inheritance is the things that we in fact take from history and live through today, right? So it's not the rule of kings which is important when he goes back into the past, but in fact what's produced by the courts of those kings in the form of quote unquote profane culture, right? And his refrain is that actually one can merely refer to this culture in order to jog Hindu and Muslim minds out of their false communalism. They don't need to be schooled in that history. Their national bond is almost intuitive. And so he never has the need to write, for instance, I think I say it somewhere in the book, The Discovery of India that Nehru does, right? There's a deep faith in the mind of the Indian public. Having said that, I still very much agree with your point, and I think actually it's Abdul Ghaffar Khan who, in a sense, speaks perhaps most to your point about on the social contract in the present. Because for him, history cannot award a nationality or an Indian nationality to the Pashtuns because they're divided across an international frontier. So are Pashtuns Afghans, or are they Indians or post-independence Pakistanis? And that, of course, Ali will know this better than me. It has a whole history thereafter in Pakistan of the internal fifth column and so on. And therefore, the ethical pledges in the present are particularly important for him to strike an agreement with the predominantly Hindu Congress, right? Predominantly. And so for him, the kind of the promise to uphold the honor of the Hindu other has to be met with the Congress promise of upholding Muslim efforts anti-colonial efforts in the frontier. And of course, that's derived out of Pashtunwali and ideas of honor and obligation, but they're of course universalized in this way, which makes him much more than a parochial thinker or a parochial figure, as he's often made out to be. And one of the things I was very invested in was turning Abdul Ghaffar Khan not only into an Indian political thinker or a South Asian political thinker, but actually somebody who's producing concepts for beyond too. And so I think in a way, by being so present focused, in a way like Jinnah, albeit differently, there is a kind of social contract that's being negotiated there in a way that those obsessed with history and this, one might say even this romantic tale of history do not produce. And I think that's very compelling. And I also thought, I mean, there probably isn't much time to go into it, but equally interesting, I thought, was this idea of community privates that you talked about, and the idea that actually is Azad, of course, Azad from the Ashraf, right? And is this actually an Ashraf Savaran, a kind of coalition that is producing both unity and disunity at the same time, commonality and distinction and parity? And in a way, I wish I'd made more of it. But yes, I think that kind of hits the nail on the head. But one thing I would just add is that for him, social practice is almost conceptually unimportant, right? So he doesn't get into things like, intermarriage and interdining and all of that, because ultimately at the theoretical level, what matters is the presence of these two, one might even say artificially divided realms of culture and religion, profane and theological. And it's in that kind of, but it's that very division that is important. Once those realms exist, whether they overlap in part, what goes in which box isn't actually that important. So he doesn't delve in as much, I think, to those social questions as perhaps some other thinkers do. And he has the privilege, of course, of doing so from the upper caste positionality that he has. To return to some of Ali's points, this idea of Islamic cosmopolitanism is very compelling, but I would just say that I don't think there's actually a tension there with secularism. Rather, secularism is the political concern of whether the state will be inclusive or not, whether society will be tolerant or not. And in fact, Islamic cosmopolitanism is deployed to produce that concern with the secular. And I don't think this is actually about making Islam tolerant by making it secular, right? Or secularizing it to produce tolerance. Rather, the endeavor is perhaps to put theology in its box and separate it as much as possible from politics. And I mean, there's a whole thing Iqbal does too, slightly differently. So yeah, I think I don't. I see them fitting together. I see Muslim universalism producing the secular, and I mean the secular in a very minimalist sense, actually. I hope I'm speaking to your point. Maybe I'm not doing it justice. The distinctions with Punjab and Bengal, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's such a important thing, and I think actually these figures, Abdullah and Farhan, located in their own majority areas, are free in the way you described to produce these thicker Indian national ideas. But you're equally right to say that that doesn't mean that they're foregoing something, right? So you can have this idea of, and you spoke about nationhood without sovereignty. Maybe nationhood with negotiated forms of sovereignty, because there are certain checks. There's only so far, certainly for Abdullah, there's only so far he will go, right? We see that play with what happens in post-colonial India. So there's only so far he will go to endorse an Indian state. It's a conditional acceptance. And so these ideas, I think, I don't think there's a surrender as such, but rather these national ideas can be fitted into different models. It just depends which model is going to play out. And then there's that whole centrifugal, centripetal kind of battle, centralization, federalism. And it's the same battle, I think, that Abdul Ghaffar Khan fights in Pakistan too, of a different kind. So there is a balancing going on there. So I think I'll leave it at there at that, just to say one point about the importance of Lajpat Rai's minorityhood, and that in Punjab allowing him to think about what it might mean for Muslims to be a minority. I think that also plays out for Sheikh Abdullah. As a majority in Kashmir, he can think about what it might mean for Hindus and Sikhs to be minorities there, precisely because he's a minority at the all India level. And so it's quite interesting, some of the stuff he produces in the 30s and 40s for minority rights, which I don't go into in the book, but I have an article on it. But that kind of transference of experiences is something that I think also kind of knits our two books together. So I'll leave it there because I know we're kind of short of time.
Perfect. Thanks. Over to you, Vanya, and a quick note to the attendees as well. If in the meantime you're formulating questions, do feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and I'd be happy to post that to our panelists or authors. Vanya.
Yeah, I think, thank you, both of you, for your comments and questions. A lot to think about. I think even after this discussion, they're very rich set of comments. I think I'll start with Ali's. So yeah, I think I very deliberately wanted to focus on Lajpat Rai's intention and really kind of bringing out the texture of his reasoning and the meaning of what that is adding up to. So audience is important, but that would have produced a even thicker book. And also, yeah, I mean, I think it is a separate question, and I really wanted to explore this idea of the internal differentiation within Hindu nationalism, what that means, and why is that relevant for today, for perhaps for us not to box a Lajpat Rai-like position into a Savarkar-like position, to enable a better democratic dialogue and understanding, and also for projects of democratic persuasion also. But I think, yeah, I mean, your question is totally valid, and I think the point about audience does come across, I think, in the last phase of Lajpat Rai's life, when he thinks he is doing all he can to realize a secular Indian nation state in the future through a militant Hindu politics, but the effect of his politics is completely counterproductive for what he's trying to realize. And you kind of see this in this kind of Hindu militancy that he's organizing and encouraging. The way he's perceived is that he is an anti-Muslim figure, and it is causing a rift between the communities, and possibly the kind of bodybuilding and the akhadas and all of that is being encouraged in self-defense, which I do take seriously as an idea. I think he does think that this is happening. He's encouraging this in self-defense, but it is perceived as aggression, and it is having that effect of undermining, intercommunity trust and peace. And yeah, so I think this brings out that kind of mismatch between the intention and the reception of his politics. And about Lajpat Rai and Jinnah, I don't know where he said this, Lajpat Rai, that Hindus will never cease to be Hindus and Muslims will never cease to be Muslims, because in the fourth phase of his life, in the mid-20s, he's really imagining that this Hindu politics is needed right now, temporarily, precisely so that a secular Indian nation state can be created in the future, where these identities, for the most part, politically won't exist, and people can unite as Indians for, on economics and politics, which is kind of largely something above religion. Although, of course, he is not completely imagining a completely homogeneous kind of Indian nation state. There is space for, personal laws or minorities to have educational institutions, or even reservations for Muslims. And also the space for religious or Muslim cultural autonomy in a federation as well. But I think here he does seem to be similar to Jinnah also, that in the future he's kind of imagining this secular Indian nation state where the primary political identity doesn't have to be based on religion. Your last point about perilous intimacies and like violence being justified in self-defense, I think I would, I mean, it's related to the earlier point, but I think I do see him as someone who is very much a product of the context and is gripped by a kind of paranoia and fear of Muslim domination, a particular image of medieval India being rekindled by what is happening in contemporary times, and this fear of Muslim minority domination, rather than rather than him ever actually articulating any ideas or dreams of Hindu cultural or political supremacy. So throughout, in any of his phases, you don't actually come across any ideas, unlike with Savarkar, where there are demands that minorities should adopt Hindu culture or revere Hindu culture, or any kind of dreams of Hindu homogeneity. In fact, there are statements against this one religion, one tongue is midsummer madness, or one church, one people, one church is medieval and tyrannical, and explicit statements of against Hindu Raj as being ruinous of Hinduism and India. So I think that is something that is different. Still, while acknowledging the perilous and very dangerous nature of his Hindu militancy, which is quite explicit and in self-defense, and also leading to aggression also by those people who are doing this. Still a distinction with Savarkar, who has these dreams of Hindu culture and political supremacy very clearly articulated. And, this claim upon India as a land of Hindus and as a land for Hindus. To Thomas's comments, I'm not sure I'll be able to do justice to all of it, but I think Lajpat Rai also sees nationalism not just as related to the political domain, but also history and culture is also the site where he's kind of articulating his ideas of nationalism. In the first, second, and third phase, nationalism is really something which is first articulated through the concepts of religion and then history and culture. And then in the last phase is when the political domain becomes very kind of predominant in Lajpat Rai's thinking. So it's really then that he's not articulating a political theory of some sort of civic values that Hindus and Muslims can be united around. That's not what's happening, but he's lost faith in the Indian nation as something that is in the new context of like this serial rioting and polarization, lost faith in the idea of the Indian nation as something which is Hindus and Muslims as being bound by a common culture or a common history, and he's really focusing on the state as some sort of a solution. So the creation of a secular state is the crucial prerequisite to realize a secular Indian nation which is united and stable and can cooperate internally with each other. I think that's mostly it. And I think about the caste, there are also two phases in Lajpat Rai's life. So there's the first phase so this is actually his second phase, but the place where he articulates the most explicit idea of caste radicalism within the frame of a Hindu community or a Hindu nation. But he is very different here from his Hindu Mahasabha phase later in the 1920s. And in this first phase, he's kind of much more radical on caste, and also in terms of Shuddhi, but also educating lower caste leaders as a means to encourage leadership within lower castes and Dalits, which can challenge upper caste arrogance, what he calls upper caste brutality or cruelty. And he kind of really dismisses caste taboos as an invention, which wasn't there in ancient India and ancient Indian texts. So any taboos of interreligious marriage or intercaste marriage or intercaste dining or intercaste living also are really kind of dismissed as an invention. And he likens upper caste to slave owners. So in a manner, a little bit reminiscent of Phule, though not exactly, but here he's being quite radical on caste.
Perfect. Thanks, Vanya. Thanks, Amar. We are now open for questions. So I think the way to do questions is to post them in the Q&A section. Yeah, Rochna, go ahead.
Yeah, while people are gathering their thoughts, thank you so much for an excellent panel to both our speakers and the discussants. These are great additions to our knowledge of political thought in South Asia. And I really like the fact that both of the books question, in a sense, received understandings or dominant understandings of, what is Hindu nationalist, or what is, as it were, the Muslim public sphere. I had a broad question, one which it basically sort of applies to both of you. And I should preface it by saying I haven't read the books yet. I would love to do so. So the question is a request for elaboration, and it's something that you may have well done in the book, in the books themselves. Which is that it's very interesting that you say that there's an approach to the accommodation of difference, which, although it intersects with the liberal secular, is still different from it, or even though it can support the liberal secular, is still different from it in these thinkers, right? In Lajpat Rai, in Azad, at least to some extent. And of course, there are internal differentiations. And as Vanya pointed out, there's also a shift over time, that we can't think of these as sort of unified bodies of thought in that sense. But if we were to try to extract this as, what would be resources for the accommodation of religious and cultural difference, radical difference, that are still different, that are an alternative to the liberal secular in some sense, even if they can intersect with these, how would you see, that for either Lajpat Rai or Azad, or one of the other, Ghaffar Khan, or Sheikh Abdullah? I'll stop there.
Am I going?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I know it's a great question, Rochna, and thank you once again for having us. And yeah, I mean, yeah, there is definitely a dialogue with liberal ideas of equality, and then also an attempt to upend them, or to reinvent them. I think, actually, Muslim political thought, you could argue, in colonial India has three options. One is the route of, say, figures like Maududi, which is to throw liberalism or the liberal nationalism out entirely as disrupting the unquestioned sovereignty of Islam, right? Which humans will wield on behalf of God, right? And then you can have a kind of Jinnah type argument that actually, which we already discussed, that the collapse of the League of Nations means that the minority has to become a nation. Or one can work within the existing polity and reframe a kind of what you could even describe as which Rajendra Prasad describes the Congress idea as an unnational state or a non-national state. I forget which one which phrase he uses, but to actually house difference within it. And I think, because of course for these Muslim thinkers, this problem is especially acute in a very existential way, obviously, that has to be theorized more thoroughly. And I think, the way to do that is through religious laws, through regional political power, right? But also there's also a very important check on how much one emphasizes this difference, right? So you will know this, that Gandhi has a very absolute understanding of distinction, because he believes that it's only then that violent brothers can be turned into friends, right? If you do away with the expectation that is written into brotherhood and turn and prize the difference that is there in friendship, one can, this is of course Vesaldeji's argument, one can produce a kind of one can defang the violence within Hindu and Muslim relations. Now, for these figures, if one were to emphasize difference to that extent, that would only minoritize Muslims further, right? Because what then is shared? What then really is national? And so points to some of the concerns that Ali raised so eloquently earlier, that actually one has to produce a nationhood. One wants a stake in a sovereign India, and therefore, if one emphasizes one's distinction too much, what then is commonality? What then is parity? And it speaks to what Thomas said about a kind of hierarchical parity, actually. But that, what does that mean for equality, right? So yeah, I think there's an important enshrining, if you like, of minority rights within a secular whole, or community rights, because of course they're uncomfortable even with the category of minority, but then also putting limits on that very difference. So there's a balance that needs to be struck there.
We also ask, what exactly do you mean by liberal secular? Because I guess one could also have two conceptions of that, right? One is like a liberal individualist imagination where they're just individual citizens, and there is, discourse around rights or the constitution or some kind of political vision, unencumbered from religious and cultural identities. But then one can also have I think, a different kind of a liberal vision where you have this kind of composite composite culture, a shared history, which is coexisting alongside this, and also some sort of group rights also. So I don't know what you meant by liberal secular, and that's, are both liberal secular, or are we just talking about the first one?
No, both could potentially be religious secular, but I suppose there is drawing upon a religious worldview that is, that may be drawn from a single religion, right? So that would be an alternative, whether it's Hindu, resources of Hindu religion in Rai's case, or Islamic. In the Islamic universe in Azad's case. So that was what I was thinking about. But you're right, there's liberal secular itself is not a single monolithic category as it's often made out to be.
I think Amar's figures are probably more kind of creative in their engagement with, this liberal secular idea, whereas Lajpatra is kind of seems to be generally conforming to the liberal secular idea, although has this phase of composite culture, public national culture, which is composite, and also a shared history, which is kind of overlaps sometimes with Gandhi and Nehru, but then he has this dream of this, sometimes a French secular kind of vision also, like a radically secular state in politics, although he knows it's not possible. And he also the other way that he challenges that liberalism is through being able to grant, even if reluctantly, Muslim reservations. So Muslim political rights sometimes is something he's quite open to.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
You're on mute.
I have a question from Bhargav, who asks, I believe this is a question directed at Vanya. Can we say that, like Kanchan Majumdar mentions in Saffron versus Green, that the general Muslim grievances in CP and Birar against Hindus initially were developed initially more by external stimuli? Similarly, Lala Lajpat Rai's initial Hindu outlook was not his own, but rather because of Arya Samaj stimuli.
Oh, I haven't read that book, but I would say it probably was a combination of both. He was definitely influenced by his Arya Samaji background, and that comes across very strongly in the first phase of his life, from the 1880s to 1900, where his religious outlook is, completely influenced by his Arya Samaji background, and his definitions of Hinduism then are also kind of influenced by his Arya Samaj association with the Arya Samaj, but it is a creative engagement also. So there is some individual agency there also in how Lajpat Rai is kind of, even in his kind of elaborations of history, if one compares him to Swami Shraddhanand, for instance, his elaboration of Indian history is different. And I kind of try to show that through how he sees in the first phase of his life, the trope of the Muslim invasions. So he doesn't attribute the decline of Hindus to Muslim rule, but in fact, Hinduism or Hindus are seen to decline because of Brahmins, and that is also an Arya Samaji influence. So two Arya Samajis, but articulating Indian history in a different way. So yeah.
I also have a question of my own for Amar. Amar, I haven't got to the end of the book, so this is possibly a question that's been answered. But as I was reading it, I did start to wonder how much of this idea of kind of interactive secularism, the idea being advanced in the decolonization phase, how much of that is tied to the historical circumstances of that period? You know, is that an idea that has any traction today, especially in these times? Or is it an idea that had fertile ground given the immediate kind of prehistory of Islamic universalism and the kind of Gandhian space that might have also kind of created space for the ideas of someone like Azad? Or do you think this is an idea that's of purely historical interest? Or given the doubling down and inevitable doubling down of politicians like Owaisi, who have to some extent rely on identitarian claims, is this an idea that we might see as a useful relic, but not something that contemporary Muslim Indian politics can draw on?
It's a wonderful point, and something that I had been wrestling with, especially towards the end of the DPhil, actually, and with the rise of the Modi at that point, winning a second term, and I wondered what the implications of my work may not be. I would say that yes, the pre-partition context, especially important, producing a kind of confident endorsement of secularism, which can do away in so many ways with demography, or make an arguably unfavorable demography work, right? And so once you partition, what then are you left with? I think there are certain things which are interesting. For instance, one of the legacies, or two of the legacies, we've already spoken about the importance of making inheritance an active principle vis-a-vis history. And I think that's especially important today when you have so much historical myth-making taking place and rewriting of history books. Azad's idea that one has to be accountable to history always, but that doesn't necessarily mean one needs a long engagement with it. It's an intricate idea, but like I said, it relies on a kind of a South Asian common sense, but one that I think actually has currency. And the other being the federalist idea that I map out in the second half of the book. India may not have its Muslim majority states anymore. There's an obvious legacy for Pakistan in Abdul Ghaffar Khan especially. But I think, there are many states in India, and I'm especially thinking of Bengal, Assam, and Kerala, where Muslims are a significant minority. They're not just 15-20% as they are in parts of North India, but actually in the 30s in some of those places. And I think that produces a very different dynamic, which allows a kind of anchored regional sense, a certain power, which, when twinned with local ideas of linguistic subnationalism, if you like, and what that means, and what that can produce in terms of Hindu-Muslim alliances to undercut a homogenizing Hindu nationalism at the center. So I think that actually there's that legacy too. Certainly, the context and Gandhian pluralism allows for this to take place. There's no doubt about that at all. That context does matter, but I don't think it. But I think what's important about political thought is actually that it can transcend its context too. And I don't believe that it's entire. This is the story of the losers. It certainly is, right? But that doesn't mean that the losers can't be reintegrated into our conversations. That's how I put it.
I would even say that in terms of interactive nationalism, I mean, the anti-CAA movement is probably a good example, no? Of like Hindus, and here I do see some similarity between Lajpat Rai in the Khilafat period and Amar's figures, where there is this Lajpat Rai is telling Hindus that you have to support the Khilafat cause as trustees of Islam. And I don't know, maybe the anti-CAA movement was one such moment in the recent past where there was this kind of interactive nationalism.
And I mean, Ali can probably speak to this better than me, but I think there's also in Abdul Ghaffar Khan a lot of there's a great deal of political theory that's produced, which can be of use to Pakistan today. When one thinks about what Pakistan might look like as an inclusive left of center polity, right? Which might be unimaginable to many people, but there's that is a project as well. And I think Ali Wazir, who's a politician on the Pashtun frontier today, actually, whether knowingly or not, I don't know, but he unwittingly kind of reanimated Abdul Ghaffar Khan's idea of pledges between different groups in a polity when he said that, we are Afghans and we are proud of it. When are the rest of when are other Pakistanis going to realize they're Indians, right? They should shed this false sense of Islamic unity, and we'll retain Islam in Pakistan. That's not under threat in any way. But once you do away with this, hyper majoritarianism, which comes from insecurity in his words, in his rendering, we can have an honest dialogue about rights for ethnic communities. And it's interesting how Sindhis, Punjabis, and others are kind of bracketed off as Indians, whereas Pashtuns are Afghans. And that's exactly what Abdul Ghaffar Khan does to establish parity in the late colonial period. That the Afghans will pull down one leg of the colonial master and the Hindus or the Indians will pull down the other. Right. I don't know how that translates into non-violence, but hey. So, but the logic is interesting.
Yeah. Perfect. I think since we're running out of time, I might give a last word, so closing comments from both yourself and both Amar and Vanya, and we'll start with Vanya.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just think that it's interesting, like this conversation and the two books. I think that both the Muslim Secular and Lajpat Rai are responses to Muslim separatism in some ways, and have meeting points, which I kind of realized while reading Amar's introduction, of this kind of loss that the pact with the loss that the Muslim Secular demands. Or accepts this kind of loss of Muslim political sovereignty. And Lajpat Rai is kind of converging with that thinking as well, of kind of not accepting that Muslims in India, I mean, it's a huge population. So what is the fear about? But I would love to actually, I don't know, in the closing remarks also, like maybe hear from Amar about what you would think about this kind of convergence between someone like Lajpat Rai and your figures. Who are both different from articulations of secularism that are articulated by Gandhi and Nehru. So Lajpat Rai is one kind, and the Muslim secular is another kind.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ali made a really interesting comment at the beginning of his remarks, where he spoke about, what is the communal, and really, is it possible to hold a strong public religious identity and still speak the language of an inclusive nationalism? Is there a kind of dissonance there? And I remember it made me think of what Iqbal said in, I think, the 20s, when, Jawaharlal Nehru is kind of, calling everybody a communalist and calling for, secular socialist politics of interest. And Iqbal kind of turns around and says, well, why is communalism a bad word suddenly? Why can't we be positively communal? Yes, there are negative elements of this. And I think in a sense, Lajpat Rai and, from the very different vantage point of minority that my figures come at it from, are kind of grappling with this problem. Is it possible to imagine something which is, shared, which retains, which kind of retains distinction within it, is it possible? And of course Iqbal does it too in a very different non-national way, explicitly non-national way. So I think that's probably where there's a convergence here, and it's a kind of an ongoing debate. And then it speaks to this point that what is the afterlife of all this stuff? I think the afterlife of all of this stuff is the fact that these questions still rumble on. You know, is India a Hindu nation? Is Pakistan a Muslim nation? What is the place of minorities in these countries? What are the future relations of these countries? So yeah, maybe just leave it there. But I think the legacies of this debate do transcend its context, and I think it's probably why we're invested in the first place.
Perfect, thank you. With these book events, we often come in with having read the news, following the elections with fairly doom and gloom prospects, and it's always nice to end on more optimistic notes. You mentioned the potential of political thought in transcending history. I think for me, one of the biggest benefits has been political thought transcending the present, and looking forward to reimagining futures of secularism and nationalism. And for doing that, we have you to thank. Please join me in thanking both our discussants and above all, both our authors for a fascinating discussion. Like I said, this discussion will be online. If there's anything you'd like us to leave out, something you'd rather say off the record, we're very happy to do that. Just drop me a line or drop Alice a line, and we can look into that for you. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've learned a huge amount. Great to see everyone as well.
And I will, by the end of the summer, I will have finished both the books. I've skimmed through both of them, but yeah, I'm getting there.
A special thanks to Tom and Ali for such a generous engagement.
Absolutely.
Really,
Thank you so much.
really
It was a
in-depth
pleasure.
engagement.
It was
Really
a pleasure.
appreciate it.
Yeah, that's fantastic and rare given the pressures on time. So thank you.
Well,
Thank
exactly.
you very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, I
Pleasure.
will let you all get back to your dinners, and Tom, I think, get back to breakfast possibly.
Something like that. Something like that. Yeah.
Or maybe now it's time to pick up the kids.
Yeah. Well, not quite.
That's how long
Not gone on that long.
It felt like we went on a while.
I hope they stay at school a little longer than that. That's the plan. Yes. Anyway, good to see everybody. I gotta run.
Yeah,
Thank you.
all right, take care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
Udit. Thanks,
Bye.
Rachana.
Bye.
For organizing everything. Thank you.